Last time we looked at the different versions of Scripture. Now what about what they are actually saying? Can we understand what they mean?
No, that's far more important. That's the whole reason for reviewing what we have.
Sure enough.
We have the right books in the Bible, we have the right words, and we have them well translated. But now, in this modern age, so many years after the writing and in a different language, can we be confident that we've really found the meaning of the book? And I think the best answer to that is just to take the Bible and open it and start reading it and see if we can feel confident that we really are interpreting the Bible correctly. In doing this, I'm very grateful for the more than 120 times that I've gone with groups through all 66 books of the Bible. I started it almost 40 years ago. We've had groups of all sizes, large and small, of all ages. We go through the Bible, usually one book a week. And of every story, every teaching, every event, we always ask the same question. What does this tell us about God? They're very relaxed meetings because no one would presume to tell anybody what he ought to see or what he ought to believe, because the Bible belongs to everybody equally. Nobody has a right to tell anybody else what it says. As Paul learned to say, let everyone be fully persuaded in his own mind. But every time we start through, the same, more or less, the same questions arise time after time. For example, there may be members of the group that have chosen to use the King James Version. Not that they'll be using this one, but small modern printings. We always want some to remind us of our roots. That's been the great Bible in the experience of so many of us. But if they choose to use the King James, they'll eventually run into strange words like, for example, booties in Habakkuk 2:7. Now, what would booties be? I wonder, Jonathan, if you could look that up and see how the word is used. Habakkuk 2:7.
And some people may have trouble finding Habakkuk too.
Or even pronounce it, perhaps.
That's right.
What do you recommend for finding Habakkuk?
Well, continue on through until you get to it and make sure you don't turn over too many pages, perhaps.
Some of those books are very brief, and if two pages are stuck together, you can miss a whole book.
Of course, there's always the easy way out, which is looking back to the original title page there, looking at the table of contents, and then you can find it from there.
Many people miss that. It's like, if all else fails, read the directions. If you can't find your place, look at the beginning in the table of contents. You'll find Habakkuk, and the page number will be there, and you can turn to it.
Okay,
now, what is this Habakkuk 2:7, booties? Does it mean a pair of children's shoes or something?
Well, just let me read the last part of the verse. And thou shalt be for booties unto them.
Thou shalt be for booties.
Strange.
Of course, if you read around it, it's a matter of warfare, and the meaning here is loot or plunder. Well, how about in Job 41:18, neesings, or is it maybe neesings? What are neesings? Is that something we should all desire to have, perhaps? Well, Job 41:18.
The verse doesn't make it that much more clear. Yeah. By his neesings a light doth shine.
And then we have to look a little further and find that it's sneezings. And then in Exodus 28:11, what are these ouches of gold or ouches of gold? Ouches sounds like something a dentist might work on.
Sounds very painful.
Ouches of gold. What's that?
Again, the last part of the verse says, thou shalt make to them to be set in ouches of gold.
And we discover that these are settings in which a gem might be placed. And then in Luke 17:9, they come across the word T-R-O-W, I trow not, or I trow not. Have you ever trowed something? What is that?
Well, the verse reads, doth he thank that servant because he did the things that were commanded him? I trow not.
That is, I think not. I suppose not. Well, now, this is no fault of the King James Version, and some of us love the language from that period, especially if you love the other literature from that period. This was simply the common speech of the day. You'd even say to your wife, I salute thee, or I prithee, or something like that. Other words that are of greater significance than this are such as the word let. For example, in Romans 1:13, Paul says, I've been longing to come to see you in Rome, but I have been let hitherto. Well, if he was let, why didn't he go? Well, because let in those days meant to hinder or to prevent, as every tennis player knows. If you're down at Wimbledon and you see someone serve and the ball hits the net first before dropping into the square on the other side, the umpire will cry, not net ball, but let ball. He isn't lisping, he's just being correct. That was a hindered, prevented ball, let ball. Another one in 1 Thessalonians 4:15, talking about the resurrection, Paul says, we who are alive and remain shall not prevent them which are asleep. And that would suggest a strange picture that here the dead are rising and the living saints are trying to prevent them, as if keeping them from going up first. Actually, prevent in 1611 meant to precede. It's not an error at all, just that the language has changed through the years. And if you take it in its modern meaning, it's a great message. In Paul's day in Thessalonica, there was grief because friends and relatives were dying and they thought the Lord would come before then. So Paul says, don't be discouraged. Those who die before the Lord comes will not be at any disadvantage. We who are alive and remain shall not precede. We will not go up first. Those who have died in Christ will rise first. God will almost make it up to them. And then we who are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them. And it puts God in a good light. Or take John 20:17, outside the tomb when Mary fell at Jesus' feet to worship him. And it seems to say, touch me not, as if, don't touch me, don't touch me. If you do, I won't be able to go to heaven, which wouldn't make any sense. Instead, if you read the original language, Jesus said to Mary, do not detain me. See, greetings took a little time in those days. So when she fell at his feet to worship him, Jesus said, I've not yet ascended to my Father yet. So detain me not, or do not go on touching me, do not go on holding me. Or take in John 2:4 at the marriage feast at Cana in Galilee, when they ran out of wine, and Mary came to Jesus and told him that they had run out. And in the older version, he says to his mother, woman, what have I to do with thee? If my mother had asked me to help her dry the dishes, and I had said, woman, what have I to do with thee, in the hearing of my father, I might not be here to tell you this at the present time. Actually, woman in the vernacular of the day could mean your wife, it might mean your mother. And so Jewish scholars of that period have told me this would be very polite. Perhaps, mother, why did you bring that problem to me? Because he had not performed a miracle yet, though as you know he did later. Or take in 1 Corinthians 10:25, where Paul tells the Corinthians to eat whatever they find in the shambles. Now, shambles, that's like the condition of a child's bedroom that hasn't been tidied up. Would Paul say, go and buy your food in an untidy place? Well, people who live in the town of York should know the meaning. There's a magnificent book just put out by the National Geographic Society entitled Britain and Ireland. And in there's a beautiful picture of the town of York and the section known as the Shambles. And it's a group of butcher shops. And that's the meaning of this word. Eat whatever you find in the meat market, without raising any question on the ground of conscience, it says. So you see, if one knows the setting, one knows the language of the time, these words are no problem. There are even dictionaries that will explain these words that have changed their meaning. Or, of course, one can use any one of these numerous modern versions. As one proceeds through the 66, every time that we do it, we find how essential it is to recognize the age-old principle of interpretation, that it was the context, that is, it was the setting, that determined the meaning of a passage when it was originally written. And to the extent that we can recreate, recover, rediscover that original setting or context, we're in a position to recover the original meaning. Now, part of that setting is the words. That's called the grammatical context, and we've illustrated that already. More important is the historical context, the circumstances of those days. If one doesn't know the circumstances, then what Paul said about marriage can be very puzzling. He seems to suggest that married Christians are second-class saints. His advice about women not speaking in church, or the dress of women, or all the fighting in the Old Testament, the representations of an angry God. For all of those, we need to recover the original setting. Now, surely we all know from daily experience in communicating with each other how important it is to put everything in this historical setting. For example, years from now, historians might be writing about this part of England, and they will come to the conclusion that Liverpool has suffered from an infestation of beetles, until they recreate the setting and find that the Beatles were a famous musical group. What a mistake could be made without knowing that. Or in playing tennis, for example, when someone hears the order, love 15, it seems a bit extravagant, doesn't it? That many. And then maybe there's a recording of a cricket match, and it's learned that somebody scored a duck. And you might wonder what ducks are doing running on the cricket pitch. Or maybe the description of a baseball game, where it's recorded that somebody caught a fly, and you'd wonder why he'd be there with his mouth open. I choose ridiculous ones to show how easy it can be so often if we recreate the historical setting. Sometimes, of course, it has more serious implications.
Mm-hmm. Can I now raise a few questions that people often ask me about the Bible?
Good.
I can get you to answer for me, perhaps. Why are there so few specific statements about God in the Bible? For example, the fact that God is love. Why doesn't the Bible explain more about God directly?
Well, I think it's so typical of God that he doesn't expect us to believe something just because he said so. God is love is a statement, it's a claim. The way that God would use would be to demonstrate that he is loving. That would be much more convincing. That would be evidence rather than a mere claim.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And why does the Bible have so much apparently unimportant detail in it? People often say, think of all those long genealogies. They're so long and boring and so apparently unimportant.
And that's why so many resolve at the beginning of the year to read the Bible through, and they don't get much further than the genealogies and numbers and so on.
That's right.
Actually, all those little details are what we need to reconstruct the setting. And if we can't recover the circumstances, then it's difficult to understand why God would so speak or so act. So personally, I'm glad for every little detail between the covers of this book.
And then again, why does the Bible seem to present so many different pictures of God? Some that seem blatantly contradictory.
Could you give an example of that?
Well, one that often comes up is the difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament in the picture of God that is given there. For example, you have Sinai with all the thunderings and lightnings that you see there, and a very angry type of God appears. And then you have the Mount of Olives, another mountain in the New Testament where Jesus wept over Jerusalem and appeared to be a very caring and loving sort of God.
Now, I see, we're taking the Bible as a whole here. I think we do very well to compare the experience on Mount Sinai and the experience on the Mount of Olives. God came down on Mount Sinai to speak to his people, and they were utterly irreverent, complaining about the water and the food, some wishing to go back to Egypt. How could God speak to them? And so he thunders to them there to get their attention and hold it long enough to even give them the 10 Commandments and tell them all the good things he was planning for them. Later on, he comes on the Mount of Olives. And here he's very gentle. He even weeps over Jerusalem. Now on Mount Sinai, the response of the people was respect, to be sure, but mixed with terror. On the Mount of Olives, he's so gentle, they even despise him there. Now how can God lead us to respect him, even to regard him with reverence, yet without fear? And all the way through the Bible, God illustrates this. He'd much rather speak to us in a still small voice. But if we will not listen, then he will thunder if need be. Those contrasts build up as you go through all 66 until you have much evidence to see how God has handled the very delicate task of trying to win our respectful willingness to listen without making us afraid.
Mm-hmm. It doesn't seem that he has much success then, does it? Even though he tries many different ways, whichever way he chooses, there is a difficulty in man's response.
How it must have pleased God when he could talk to Elijah in the still small voice, and Elijah covered his head in reverence. He was not afraid. There was no need to be afraid, but he was deeply reverent.
Well, let me take you into some other points. How about God's commands now? The command that was given through Moses, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, a very apparently vindictive statement, and then Jesus' statement, which was, of course, turn the other cheek. How would you combine those?
Well, if you look back, you see the misbehavior of the people. A gentle regulation would have had little effect on them, and it required so stern a measure as an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. The one who said, turn the other cheek, must have hated having to give them that regulation, but it was necessary. Later he comes in person and says the ideal is to turn the other cheek. Of course, when he turned the other cheek, they hit that cheek too. It's really only safe to do this when everyone is loving and gracious. I'll never forget the experience when we were going through the Bible with children. That's one of the most interesting trips we've ever had. And we came to this very question of eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth and turn the other cheek. And I asked the children, what would you do if somebody knocked out your tooth? And there was a small boy sitting next to me, just 8 years old. His name is Casey. Well, he said very thoughtfully, if somebody knocked out my tooth, first I think I'd knock out his, and then I'd turn the other cheek. See, he was trying to understand the meaning the best he could.
But the latter one was better than the former. Rather, as Paul says, I show you a more excellent way. So then, after your 120 trips through the Bible, do you have any specific advice to other Bible readers?
Oh, I think the most important one is always to ask the right question. And I think the most productive question is, what does this say about God, of every story, teaching, and event? The Bible is quite apparently not a code book of deeds to be done and sins to be shunned. As Jesus said in John 5:39 and 40, the Scriptures testify of me. And so, asking that question of everything, we learn to view the Bible as a whole and relate all its parts to the one central theme, the revelation of the truth about our God. It's so hazardous to take here a little and there a little. If you put the right littles together, you can make the Bible teach anything you wish. So I found all these trips through that as we proceed, there begins to emerge a pattern, a consistent picture of God and His handling of the disorderly behavior within His family. There emerges a picture of an infinitely wise God who seems willing to go to any lengths to keep in touch with His people, to meet them where they are, to speak a language they can understand, leading them no faster than they're able to follow, and constantly running the risk of being misunderstood in demonstrating His majesty and power when necessary to get their attention and hold it long enough to tell a little more of the truth about Himself. And we just admire God more and more the more we go through.
Now, in thinking about the meaning of the Bible, what about that last book in the Bible that so many people find very hard to understand, the book of Revelation?
With all the beasts and the heads and the horns and
symbols
everything,
and so on.
it can be very mystifying. Of all books in the Bible, one needs to recreate the setting. Written near the end of the first century, the Christians who received this book were becoming very discouraged. They had expected the Lord to come sooner, but now their friends and loved ones were dying. All the apostles were dead but one, and he was a prisoner on the Isle of Patmos. Heresies were arising in the church. There was great opposition and persecution. They were tempted to become very discouraged. And God sent them the last book in the Bible, the book of Revelation, certainly not to puzzle them still more. They needed encouragement. And so when this book arrived, someone stood up and read it out loud all the way through. You remember, no chapters, no verses, no temptation to stop anywhere in the middle of something puzzling. They read all the way through. And as they did, they saw that up in heaven there seemed to be rejoicing over God's victory. That things were going well up there, whereas down on this earth the saints seemed to be dragging their weary way toward the kingdom, and they identified with that. And then they came to about the middle of the book, and the first mention in the whole Bible of the war up in heaven, and the adversary, and that would remind them of the story in the Garden of Eden in Genesis, the accusations that the adversary leveled against God and His character and His government. And the Christians realized they were involved in something much bigger than just what was happening on this planet. And as we read that 66th book, we too are perhaps well advised to read everything in the Bible in that larger setting of this great conflict, this great controversy over the character and government of God Himself. Now, it's true, this book has not been used a great deal, not in that way. Even Luther, and you think what he's meant to all of us Christians, really taking us back to the Bible. He didn't know what to do with that last book. In fact, in his translation of the New Testament into German, he says, there's no way the Holy Spirit could have inspired this book, for I cannot find Christ in it. That was his difficulty at the time. But some of us, as we view it along with all the others, find Christ very much in that last book. And we read all the rest of the 66 books in that larger setting, suggested in that document that was sent to encourage early Christians, not to take a narrow view, but to look up and take a larger view. And then perhaps one might be more willing to wait till God has brought all these things to a successful conclusion.
Mm-hmm. And then what about Jesus Christ? You said He came as a better way, a different way of thinking, and perhaps you could think of something like Hebrews 1:1.
Well, after all these other things, surely the clearest revelation of all is the one provided by the Son of God Himself. In Hebrews 1:1, the apostle says, "In many and various ways God spoke to our fathers of old by the prophets. But in these last days He's spoken to us by a Son." Now, there's no question. The way the Son lived, the things He taught, the way He suffered, and the unique and awful way He died is the clearest revelation of the truth about God the universe will ever see or ever need. You're right.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So why don't we stay with just the New Testament then? Why do we bother with those 39 books of that very difficult Old Testament with its cruelty, violence, fightings, the flood as well? All those things that are so hard to understand about the picture of God.
I think because of all those problems you mentioned and many more like it, many have tended to use the New Testament somewhat to the exclusion of the Old. I think to their great loss. Jesus always used the Old Testament, of course, and so did Paul and the others. Maybe this was what was behind Philip's question recorded in John 14, where Philip said to Jesus, "Show us the Father, and we'll be satisfied." And Jesus said, "Have I been with you all this time, Philip, and you don't know me?" And Philip apparently said, by implication, "But our question is not about you, Christ. We acknowledge you to be the Son of God." And we've been pleasantly surprised to find how comfortable we can be with such a one as you. What we want to know about is the Father. That is, we want to know about the God of all that fighting that you mentioned.
The Old Testament.
We want to know about the God who thundered on Sinai, the God who drowned all but 8 in a flood, the God who said, when you go to battle, kill the women, kill the children, the God who ordered the stoning of Achan and swallowed up Korah, Dathan, and Abiram and killed 185,000 Assyrians in one night, the God who said, in the day you eat thereof you will die. And on through all those stories in the Old Testament, Jesus, could the Father be like you? And Jesus replied to Philip, "If you have seen me, you have seen the Father." And as for those difficult stories in the Old Testament, he might have gone on to say, don't take them to mean that the Father is less gracious and less approachable than you found me to be. Actually, if you've seen me, you have seen the Father. And the one who led Israel through the wilderness was I myself. As 1 Corinthians 10:4 says, the one who led Israel through the wilderness is the one we call Christ. And you wonder why the disciples didn't begin to ask him questions about all the problems you've raised. Why
right.
then all the fighting? Why did you order the stoning of Achan? But the only question they were interested in at the moment was, what positions will we hold in the kingdom? So we don't have the answers on the record. It's just up to us now to ask the questions about all those stories and how rewarding it is to do so.
And I'm sure in your group Bible studies you do come into some problems that baffle the group, perhaps not you if you've done it 120 times, but what do you do when people come to problems in the Bible?
I always say, read on. It may get worse before it gets better, but let's read on and let the Bible explain itself.
And do you do that with those, the book of Judges, for example, with all the cruelty and the immorality there?
Oh, the dreadful stories in the book of Judges provide a very good illustration. Some years ago, a man wrote this extraordinary book, The Bible Unmasked. An avowed atheist himself, he took all the unpleasant stories in the Bible, laid them end to end, and in later editions of this same book, he even had line drawings which are not too seemly to look at. And he said, how could you parents allow your children to read such an immoral, cruel book? But you see, he took all the stories out of their setting. It would be like taking all the pictures of disease in the medical book and printing them without the setting of the remedy. It would be useless, even repulsive. The Bible is very candid about sin, but it always presents the descriptions in the setting of the remedy.
After so many trips through the Bible, aren't you beginning to get a little bored by it?
No, I look forward every time to going through it again.
And if the Bible is constantly telling us to do something to be saved, to be obedient, to follow the commandments, to love everybody, and if he threatens terrible punishment, doesn't that interfere with your concept of God who values nothing higher than our freedom?
Well, that's our question for next time. What does God want of us? I believe that our understanding of what God wants of us says a great deal about the kind of person we believe him to be.